The fluorescent lights of the Tokyo General ER hummed a tune of quiet suffering. It was a sound Lena had grown used to, a backdrop to the beeps of monitors and the rustle of sterile packaging. 8 months pregnant and on her feet for 10 hours straight, she felt the familiar ache in her lower back sharpen into something else. Something tight and insistent. She leaned against the cool metal of a supply cart, pressing a hand to the hard curve of her belly, her breath catching in her throat. It was just a Braxton Hicks contraction. It had to be.
Too early.
Far too early. Still, a primal fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She was alone. In a city of millions, she had made herself an island, and the tide was rising. A name, a ghost she had buried for nearly a year, rose to her lips on a whispered exhale. Ryota. The name felt foreign, dangerous, a key to a door she had locked and sealed shut. Saying it felt like a betrayal of the quiet, safe life she had meticulously built for her unborn son. A life away from him. Away from the scent of smoke and iron that clung to his custom-tailored suits. Away from the lethal stillness in his hands. That was when the doors hissed open, admitting a gust of rain-slicked night air and chaos. 2 men, their faces grim, half carried, half dragged a third between them. The injured man was bleeding heavily from his side, his cheap suit soaked a dark, glistening red. Lena's training kicked in, pushing the fear and the phantom pain aside. She straightened up, her voice clear and steady as she directed the men to an empty trauma bay. Get him on the gurney. Now. She pulled on a pair of gloves, her movements efficient. As she began cutting away the man's shirt, his eyes, glazed with pain, focused on her. A flicker of recognition. A slow, cruel smile stretched his lips, blood smearing his teeth. Well, he rasped, his voice a wet rattle. Look what we have here. The boss's lost treasure. Lena's blood went cold. He wasn't one of Ryota's. The crude tattoos snaking up his neck belonged to the Sadogumi, their rivals. The ones who played dirtier, who broke every code. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, her voice clipped as she pressed gauze to the wound. He hissed, a sound of pure venom. Don't you? His gaze dropped deliberately to her stomach. Heard, he lost something precious. Looks like you just got bigger. He'll pay a fortune to get his property back. Both of you. The world tilted. He knew. How could he know? She had been so careful. The threat wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. A commodity to be traded, a weakness to be exploited. Her son, her baby was a target before he had even taken his first breath. The sterile safety of the hospital evaporated, replaced by the chilling reality of the world she had run from. It had found her. She told herself it was survival instinct that made her look toward the entrance. A desperate, foolish hope for a rescuer she had no right to summon. That is when she made the mistake of looking up. The automatic doors slid open again, silent as a grave. And there he stood, Ryota. He was not there for the bleeding man on her gurney. His presence was of a different order entirely. He moved like the room owed him space, the air itself seeming to thin around him. His suit was a dark, immaculate gray, the kind of material that probably cost more than her entire nursing school tuition. His black hair was expertly cut, every strand in place, but it was his stillness that commanded the room. A predator's calm. His eyes, dark and depthless, swept the ER, dismissing the chaos, the staff, the dying man. They landed on her. First on her face, a flicker of something she couldn't name, and then they traveled down to her white coat, stretched taut over the undeniable swell of her belly. The silence that fell between them was not empty. It was a physical thing, heavy and absolute, pulling all the sound from the room. The Sadogumi man on the gurney choked out a laugh, a gurgle of blood and triumph. Ryota's gaze snapped back to him, and the temperature in the trauma bay dropped 10 degrees. He took one step into the room, then another. He didn't hurry. He didn't need to. The 2 men who had brought the patient in scrambled backward, their hands held up in a gesture of surrender. Ryota stopped beside the gurney, his shadow falling over Lena. He looked down at the man, his expression unreadable, carved from stone. Then he looked at her. He said her name, and it sounded different than anyone else had ever said it. Not a question, not an accusation. A statement of fact. A claim. Lena. That was the moment everything changed. The life she had built was over. The lie she had lived was exposed. He knew. And in his world, knowledge was ownership. He didn't wait for an answer. Two of his own men, materializing from the shadows of the hallway, flanked him. They were dressed in the same severe, dark suits, their faces blank masks of loyalty. Ryota gave a nearly imperceptible nod toward the wounded man. He said too much, Ryota stated, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. It was not an explanation. It was a verdict. His men moved with surgical precision. One of them produced a syringe from his pocket. Before Lena could process what was happening, before she could protest, the needle was plunged into the man's foreline. The Satogumi soldier's eyes went wide, a silent scream forming on his lips before his body went slack, the heart monitor beside him dissolving into one long, final tone. Lena stared, her gloved hands frozen over the now-still chest. She had taken an oath to save lives. She had just watched one be extinguished with the casual indifference of someone swatting a fly. "You're coming with me," Ryota said. It wasn't a request. He took her arm, his grip firm but not bruising. He was steering her away from the bed, away from her job, away from the life that was no longer hers. She could feel the hard muscle beneath the fine wool of his suit, the faint, familiar scent of cedar and something cold, like winter air, enveloped her. The scent she used to associate with a dangerous sort of safety. "I can't just leave," she whispered, the protest weak even to her own ears. "You already have," he replied, his voice devoid of any emotion. He guided her toward the exit, his men forming a silent, impenetrable wall around them. The rest of the ER staff seemed frozen in time, too terrified to intervene, to even meet their eyes. They were ghosts in their own hospital. Outside, a black sedan idled at the curb, its engine a low purr. The rain had picked up, slicking the Tokyo streets into a river of neon light. One of his men opened the rear door. Ryota's hand on her back was insistent, guiding her into the plush leather interior. The door closed with a heavy, final thud, sealing them in. Sealing her in. The car pulled away from the curb, melting into the city's traffic. Lena stared out the window, watching the hospitals shrink behind them. Her sanctuary. Her prison. Now just a memory. She was in his car, in his world, and carrying his child. A secret that had just become the most dangerous truth in Tokyo. The silence in the car was a living entity. Ryota sat beside her, not looking at her, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked city passing by. His profile was sharp, a study in controlled violence. The set of his jaw was tight, a muscle ticking near his temple. He was furious. She didn't need to be a mind reader to know that. "Why didn't you tell me?" he finally asked, his voice deceptively soft. Lena turned from the window. Her fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but defiance was a fire in her veins. She had left him for a reason. She had to remember that. "Why do you think? Look at what just happened. You had a man killed in an emergency room. That is why, Ryota. I didn't want my child anywhere near that. Near you." His head turned slowly, and his eyes met hers. For the first time, she saw past the cold fury to the storm beneath. It was something deeper, something that looked almost like pain. "And you thought you could keep him safe from them? Alone?" He gestured vaguely at the city, beyond the armored glass. "That world doesn't forget, Lena. It doesn't let go. Leaving me didn't make you invisible. It made you a target." The car ascended a private ramp into an underground garage, the steel gate rolling shut behind them with a deafening clang. They were in his fortress, a luxury high-rise in Shinjuku that bristled with unseen security. He led her to a private elevator, his hand once again on the small of her back. The touch was proprietary, a brand. The penthouse was a palace of glass and steel, with a panoramic view of the glittering city. It was cold, sterile, and beautiful, just like him. It was the cage she had escaped from. "You will stay here," he said, walking toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. "You will be safe here." "Safe? Or a prisoner?" she shot back, her voice shaking slightly. He turned. "Is there a difference?" Before she could answer, a sudden, sharp explosion from the street below rocked the entire building. The glass shuddered in its frame. Alarms began to blare from somewhere deep within the tower. Ryota moved in a blur. In a single, fluid motion, he crossed the room, grabbed her, and threw them both to the floor behind a large marble sofa, shielding her body with his own. His weight was heavy, solid, a wall of muscle and expensive fabric between her and the world. His hand, large and warm, landed instinctively on her belly, a gesture of pure, unthinking protection. The gesture undid her. Beneath the terror, beneath the anger, a flicker of something else sparked to life. The feeling of being protected by the most dangerous thing in the room. His heart hammered against her back, a frantic, powerful rhythm. He was not as calm as he appeared. His men were already speaking into their wrists, their voices urgent but controlled. "Car bomb." Sadogumi greeting. "Perimeter is holding." Ryota pushed himself up, pulling her with him. His eyes scanned her, searching for any injury. "Are you hurt? The baby?" "We're fine," she managed, her voice breathless. He stared at her for a long moment, the chaos of the alarms fading into the background. What she did not know yet was that this was the beginning of her real education in his world. Safety was not a place. It was proximity to him. Later that night, after the building was secured and the silence returned, he brought her a tray of food himself. She was sitting on the edge of a bed in a guest room that was larger than her entire apartment. He set the tray down. "You need to eat." She looked at him, at the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes. "Why are you doing this, Ryota?" He stood by the door, his hands in his pockets, looking strangely out of place without his suit jacket. He wore a simple black shirt that stretched across his broad shoulders. The intricate lines of a tattoo, a dragon's tail, peeked out from his collar. "Years ago," he said, his voice quiet, distant, "I had a sister, Aiko. She was 17. She got caught in the crossfire between my father and an old rival. I was supposed to be watching her that day. I was late." He paused, and the weight of that silence filled the room. Lena watched him, her own anger receding in the face of his raw, exposed pain. This was his wound, the shame he carried. "I found her on the street," he continued, his eyes fixed on some point in the past. "I failed her. I will not fail my son." He said it with such absolute certainty. My son, not our son. A claim staked with the force of an empire. She saw it then. He wasn't just protecting her. He was trying to exorcise a ghost. She and the baby were his chance at redemption, a debt he was determined to pay. And in that moment, she made a deliberate choice. She could fight him, she could try to run again, and likely get herself and her child killed. Or she could stay. She could navigate this lethal world from the inside, from beside him. It was the smarter play. The only play. "Okay," she said softly. "I'll stay." His gaze met hers, and something shifted in his expression. It wasn't relief. It was the quiet satisfaction of a predator whose prey had finally stopped running. He gave a single, sharp nod and left, closing the door softly behind him. Lena picked up the chopsticks and began to eat, the food tasteless in her mouth. She was no longer just a nursing student. She was a player in a game she didn't know the rules to, allied with the most dangerous man she had ever known. The days that followed blurred into a routine of gilded captivity. Ryota was a constant, silent presence. He worked from his home office, a room filled with screens and hushed phone calls. He never touched her, but his eyes were always on her. She caught him watching her when she read, when she walked the length of the vast living room for exercise, when she stood at the window looking down at the city she could no longer touch. One afternoon, she found a file on the corner of his desk.
Her name was on the tab.
Her hand trembled as she opened it. Inside were surveillance photos, reports, details of her life for the past 8 months. Her apartment building, the hospital, the grocery store she frequented. He hadn't just found her. He had been watching her the entire time. The knowledge felt like a violation, a cold hand squeezing her heart. This wasn't protection. It was obsession. It was control. She confronted him that evening, the file slapped down on the dining table between them. What is this? Were you ever going to tell me? He didn't even glance at the file. I was ensuring your safety. This isn't safety. This is stalking, she cried, her voice rising. You had no right. I have every right, he said, his voice dropping to a lethal calm. He is my son. That gives me every right. The war between them was back, cold and bitter. But it was interrupted again, this time more violently. As his driver was taking her to a private, prearranged doctor's appointment, a black car slammed into theirs, sending them spinning across the rain-slicked road. The sound of screeching metal and shattering glass was deafening. Lena's world became a vortex of motion and impact. The seatbelt bit into her, her head snapping back against the headrest. Then, a sudden, blinding pain shot through her abdomen. Not a contraction. Something worse. A sharp, tearing agony. She gasped, looking down. A dark stain was spreading across the pale gray fabric of her dress. Ryota was there in minutes, pulling her from the wreckage himself. The street was a scene of chaos, his men already engaged in a firefight with the attackers. He ignored it all, his focus entirely on her. His face, usually a mask of control, was pale, his eyes wide with a terror he couldn't hide.
He saw the blood.
No, he breathed, the word a prayer and a curse. He lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing and carried her through the crossfire, his body a shield, his dress shirt quickly becoming stained with her blood. The shock, the pain, the fear, it was all too much. A powerful contraction seized her, forcing a cry from her lips. It was happening.
Now.
In the middle of a street war. Back in the penthouse, his personal doctor, a grim-faced old man, confirmed their worst fears. The impact had caused a placental abruption. The baby was in distress. They had to deliver him.
Now.
There was no time to get to a hospital. The guest room was turned into a makeshift delivery room. As Lena writhed in pain, the contractions coming fast and hard, Ryota's phone, lying on the nightstand, began to ring. The caller ID read, Sato, the rival boss. Ryota was across the room, speaking in low, urgent tones with his security head. He didn't hear it, but Lena did. On pure, desperate instinct, she reached for the phone. Her hand shook as she answered. Where is he? Sato's voice was a triumphant sneer. Tell him his little gift on the street was just the beginning. Lena took a ragged breath, the pain a white-hot fire. She channeled the ice she'd seen in Ryota's veins. He's not here, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. He went to the docks. Warehouse 4. He thinks you're holding something of his there. It was a lie, a piece of a plan she'd overheard Ryota discussing days ago, a trap he was setting for a different operation. She was deploying it now, a soldier in her own war. There was a pause on the other end. Is that so? Sato said, a hint of suspicion in his voice. Go see for yourself, Lena gasped, another contraction ripping through her. She ended the call, dropping the phone. She had just crossed a line. She had lied, manipulated, and set a man on a path to his death to buy herself time. She had used their tactics against them. Ryota was suddenly beside her, his hand gripping hers. He must have heard the end of the conversation. He looked from the phone to her face, his expression a mixture of shock and something else.
Awe.
He leaned close, his breath warm against her ear as she cried out in pain. I destroyed my family to build this empire, he whispered, his voice rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before. I will burn this entire city to the ground for you and our son. It was not a declaration of love. It was a confession, an oath of allegiance sworn in the midst of agony and gunfire. It was more real, more dangerous, and more binding than love ever could be. The tension between them had finally found its name. Not love, but a shared, savage will to survive, to protect what was theirs. Hours later, the final confrontation was happening a city away, at the docks, while Lena fought her own battle in the penthouse. Ryota had taken the bait she'd offered his enemy. He'd used her lie as the centerpiece of his final move against the Sato Gumi. She had not been rescued. She had been part of the strategy. The doctor's voice was a calm anchor in the storm of her pain. Ryota's most trusted lieutenant, a man named Isao, stood guard outside the door, the sounds of a distant, muffled conflict echoing from the floors below. With one final, desperate push, a cry torn from the depths of her soul, her son was born. He was small, so small, but his cry was strong and furious, cutting through the tension in the room. The doctor laid him on her chest, and the world fell away. Nothing else mattered. Not the gunshots, not the lies, not the blood. Just the warm, wriggling weight of her child against her skin. Ryota returned as the sun was beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the city. He was still in his blood-spattered shirt, his face etched with a deadly exhaustion. But the war was over. He walked into the room and stopped, his gaze falling on the tiny, dark-haired baby nestled in Lena's arms. He approached the bed slowly, as if approaching a sacred altar. He didn't say a word, just looked from his son's face to Lena's. The cold mask was gone. In its place was a raw, unguarded vulnerability. He had won the war for his territory, but this was the prize that mattered. He reached out a hand, his fingers, long and elegant and stained with violence, gently brushing the baby's cheek. Then his eyes met hers. Isao was injured, he said, his voice quiet. A cost had been paid. He will recover. But nothing in this world is free. He looked at their son again. He has your eyes. He did not say he loved her. He did not apologize for the world he had dragged her back into. He said something more significant. The old men in my organization answer to me, he said, his voice low and absolute. I answer to you. You and him. You are the head of this family. Everything I have is yours. Everything I am is your shield. It was an abdication and a coronation all in one. He was not giving her a place beside him. He was placing her above him, the new center of his empire. Lena looked down at her son, his tiny hand curled around her finger. She thought of the fear, the blood, the choices she had made. She had lied. She had manipulated. She had become a part of this world not as a victim, but as a queen defending her territory. She had saved him just as surely as he had saved her. She looked up at Ryota, who had moved to the window. He stood silhouetted against the dawn, a guardian watching over his city, his family. He wasn't the man she had run from anymore. Or perhaps he was, and she was no longer the woman who needed to run. She had found her power not in escaping his world, but in claiming her place within it. The choice had been made, not in a moment of passion, but in the crucible of fire and birth. This was her home now. This was her empire. And she would defend it,